Good evening and welcome to Inside Government, a show brought to you by CUE Community College and is shown on Spectrum, Verizon, Fios, as well as Auburn Regional Media Access, known as ARMA to many. Win 89.1, the college's radio station, where it's played on Saturday mornings. I'm your host, Guy Cosentino. Last summer, harmful algae blooms hit Owasco Lake, as expected, but they also hit several other lakes in central New York, including Skaneateles, for what may have been the largest number of blooms that had been there in a while. The City of Auburn is also dealing with this issue through testing for neurotoxins and has now been looking at suing the state of New York, which they are doing. With all that in mind, we have tried to give an update about what the watershed looks like and what it is doing and what we can expect on the new year and what we saw in the previous year. And we're delighted to have, as I think he has joined us at least once or twice every year for the last 6 years, while he has been Executive Director, Dr. Adam Effler, who is Executive Director of the Owasco Lake Watershed Management Council, to come into the studio and give us an update about what's going on. Welcome back.
Good evening, Guy. Thank you so much.
It's nice to see you back here in the studio. Let's start off with some basics because sometimes people may not know what the watershed is and what it covers.
Right, so the watershed for Owasco Lake is nearly 210 square miles. And in terms of definition of terms, the watershed is really the drainage basin. It's all of the land area that drains into Owasco Lake. Essentially the watershed conditions, from rain conditions to snow melt, all affect the propensity for pollution within the watershed to be suspended and discharged to the lake itself, which of course can drive perturbations of lake water quality.
So how many counties does it cover?
So there's the three counties. There's Onondaga County, just a sliver, Cayuga County, vastly, the watershed is Cayuga County, and then there's Tompkins County at the south end of the watershed.
And compared to the Skaneateles watershed, because we heard a lot about that at the end of the fall last year, what's the size difference between, is the Owasco watershed bigger than Skaneateles?
Right, it is. What's interesting about the Owasco Lake watershed is the watershed to lake ratio is the largest of all of the finger lakes. The Owasco Lake's watershed is 20 to 1. Whereby Skaneateles Lake.
When you say 20 to 1, 20.
So let's say, for every 20 square feet of watershed area, there's 1 square foot of lake size area. Okay. And so that's a very large ratio, 20 to 1. Whereby Skaneateles Lake is somewhere near 4 to 1, right? So much less influenced by the watershed activities because that watershed to lake ratio is so much lower.
And who is legally responsible for protecting the watershed?
That's a great question. The legal responsibility falls on New York State. Is really the main entity. But when it comes to the provision of drinking water, of course, the water purveyors are responsible for health and public safety of the drinking water resource. That would be the City of Auburn and the town of Owasco for Owasco Lake.
So City of Auburn does about 60,000 people, I don't know, maybe 40,000 people there. And then Owasco does Owasco and Fleming, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
And I've seen an estimate anywhere between 40 and 50,000 in terms of the total consumer base for drinking water.
And does that mean that Auburn and Owasco on their own can impose regulations?
Right, so as water purveyors under existing New York State public health law, they are allowed to develop under community process recommended updates to watershed rules and regulations. Our current watershed rules and regulations were approved in 1984. But ultimately, New York State, and it's the State Department of Health, is responsible for promulgating those revised and recommended regulations.
But it hasn't been that since 1984 the city and maybe the town of Owasco, but I think they've kind of worked in conjunction with each other, have not tried to change those regulations and update them.
That's indeed true, Guy. Yes. So there was a community consensus process that was started, it's going to be maybe 9 years ago-ish.
So before you came here?
Before I started, yeah, that process was underway. I believe it started around 2016 to 2017, somewhere in that time frame. And it was a 3-year process at the community level. So I got to be involved with that for at least a couple of years before we got underway with state consensus. And ultimately, we were looking at about 5 years for the process, whereby the state then was in a position to review and approve the proposed regulations.
And is this the so-called 9 Elements Plan, or is this something else?
This is something else,
Okay.
yeah. So that project was spearheaded by the Cuyahoga County Department of Planning on behalf of the water purveyors, the city and the town. And the 9-element plan, although there are clearly synergies between what was recommended in the updated rules and regulations and what is also recommended within the state-approved clean water plan, that's the 9-element plan. Although there were synergies there, they were 2 separate projects.
So let's go back to the regulations that took 9 years to come about. You sent them to the state of New York. You just figured that they would approve them and you would implement them, correct?
Well, we didn't figure that it would be as expeditious as just a quick approval and turnaround. We knew there was state consensus required, and we were underway with that and making good inroads there. But however, that project was recently terminated at some point
By
within
the state?
By the state,
Okay.
yes. Yeah.
So there was consensus, no.
Well, so that we were working through the consensus process at the state level, provision by provision. And when we came upon the nutrient management provision within the recommended updated rules and regs, and arguably based on that synergy with the Clean Water Plan and the recommendations within that Clean Water Plan, the nutrient management provision within the rules and regs was the most important of the regulations. At the local level, we were unable to make any advancement or change with working with New York State on that particular provision.
And the end result has been that the City of Auburn has brought a lawsuit against the state.
That's correct. There was an initial lawsuit through what this is called an Article 78 with New York State. And the response from the state to that initial lawsuit was a letter issued directly to the water purveyors that was rather short, concise, and that stated that the state would thereby terminate the whole process.
So does that mean the lawsuit doesn't exist anymore?
As I understand it, the initial lawsuit regarding the lack of the state's movement on nutrient management specifically still is integral, but there's a much more pressing lawsuit, which is the second Article 78 that was brought to bear, where the intent is to hold the state accountable for its responsibility to update rules and regulations under existing New York State public health law.
And are you the only watershed who's had this issue with the state?
Recently. So there are many eyes on this project statewide.
To see
where it goes. I mean, I gather there would be many stewards like the Management Council looking to protect water quality, looking to leverage this particular tool, this regulatory tool, who want to see the extent to which we're successful.
So are you a party to the suit?
The Management Council is not a client under the suit.
Okay,
Yes.
but you are supportive of the suit?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, why?
Well, so we currently have a regulatory division called the Owasco Lake Watershed Inspection and Protection Division, whereby we implement 1984 watershed rules and regulations. And we, on a daily basis, observe the limitations of those regulations that really fell in certain areas to have more detailed language and expectations within the various provisions that are set forth.
Have you been told by either the city's legal counsel or for what you have gleaned from discussions, Article 78s are pending. Where do you see this? How long do you think it is before you get some answers?
So as I understand it, the proceeding was moved to Albany several months ago.
Home turf advantage?
Perhaps, I don't know. And the latter 78, the second Article 78, is being reviewed by a judge there in an Albany court.
The reason I ask this is because we have had school educators in that seat and superintendents. They have dealt with a fair funding issue that might have started as a small lawsuit, but ended up going to decades before they got to an end and may not have been ended. Mm-hmm. So I guess the question for viewers may be, is there a light at the end of the tunnel that says, we'll get to this point and we'll know one way or the other, or could this continue in litigation for some time?
I don't know the answer to that exactly, Guy. I mean, I believe at this point we're waiting for a response from the judge reviewing. Most recently, it was a request for dismissal for the second Article 78 by New York State.
And did the judge rule on that?
They have not yet ruled on that.
So, all right, we'll come back to those things. I want to get back to let's talk about the midpoint of last year to the end of last year. How did the Owasco Watershed make out with algal blooms? Were they earlier than normal? Were they bigger than normal? Were they smaller? Did they disappear quicker? How did you end 2024?
So it was a tough, harmful algal bloom season for us this last year. And as I believe you noted earlier in the special, Skaneateles Lake, which is considered one of the cleanest and one of the most pristine of the Finger Lakes, experienced more harmful algal blooms than ever last year. Harmful algal blooms are a relatively new phenomenon. They occur in a way that's very both spatially and temporally discrete. I think before in our discussions we've referred to them as plain whack-a-mole, okay. Right? Whack-a-mole. Right. They sort of pop up, and researchers who
it's
study.
Not like pouring salt on a snail. You don't have that option.
No, well, you don't, and there are some that are considering that sort of option. Is what researchers
please no letters that I suggested we pour salt on snails, but
so there are some who may advocate for that sort of approach, which researchers like myself would refer to as a top-down approach, which means how do you mitigate for harmful algal blooms after they occur or while they're occurring?
Is there a process?
There are some new technologies that are being considered. One of them is called oxidation cavitation. Essentially what it does is
sounds like you shake the water.
That's exactly right. It creates a scenario where there's cavitation in the direct vicinity of a bloom, and then it causes the molecules in that area to implode. All sorts of concerns with that approach, right? I mean, what does that do to the ecology of the lake and the animals and biota that exist therein? Not a recommended approach in my mind. What we focus on is considered the bottom-up approach. And what that means is we're targeting pollutant reduction, namely the reduction of phosphorus. Okay, and so phosphorus is the limiting nutrient relative to an organism's need for growth in the context of the growth of algae and macrophytes, or otherwise known as weeds, within the lake.
So did the blooms appear earlier last year than in previous years, or roughly around, it's usually mid-July, early August that you start getting notices that this part of the lake is closed, this summer camp can't do canoeing, those types of things.
That's right. It's the warm, quiescent period of the lake and the lake ecology when the blooms start to occur. From what I recall, the timing was fairly consistent with what we see, but sort of the veracity, intensity of the blooms themselves was great.
Which meant they released more neurotoxins into the water.
I believe that there'd be some consistency there. It's the actual monitoring of the blooms themselves based on observations is sort of an imperfect science, right? So, I mean, we have volunteers out making those observations, reporting through what's called nyhabs.com. That's the New York State DEC's, Department of Environmental Conservation's program webpage that allows volunteers to report sightings.
So it's not like the state doesn't know that these are occurring.
Oh, they know they're occurring.
They just don't want, they're just not acting on how you're making recommendations to solve this issue.
So with regards to the updating the rules and regulations, we're meeting some barriers there. Not so much specifically through the DEC, but through the agency that's responsible for promulgating rules and regs, and that's the Department of Health. Because this is really a public health law and regulation, because of course this concerns the drinking water supply.
So basic question is water from the City of Auburn when I turn on my tap, or if I live in Owasco, turn on my tap, is it safe?
Absolutely. It's absolutely safe. And we've received that concern and question previously.
There's a pending lawsuit in the city now.
Yes.
That has popped up in the last couple of weeks.
Yes, yes. So the history here is such that the first occurrence that was observed, identified, recorded for Owasco Lake for a harmful algal bloom was in 2014. That doesn't mean it didn't occur prior to that, but that's the first instance where it was observed and recorded. 2016 was the first occurrence where it was observed at the intake, and immediately the city got underway with local dollars and with state support to implement carbon filtration. And it's through the carbon filtration that the cyanotoxins are actually removed from the raw water.
So that's last year. Mm-hmm. I know you and your wife like to ski. Mm-hmm. I, on the other hand, likes the sun a little bit differently. But we've had a larger amount of snowfall and storms and cold weather this year than we may have had in the last 3 or 4, or since you've been here for 6 years. Is this type of winter, forget what's going up in past Fulton in the North Country, for Owasco Lake, has the amount of snowfall and cold weather give you any pause or concerns about what may occur this year and this summer, in summer 2025?
That's a great question. So the effect of snow melt in some ways is comparable to stormwater conditions, whereby there's a propensity for sediments to be suspended, pollutants to be suspended, and make their way towards the lake and discharge to the lake itself. That being said, the response to that pollution suspension and discharge with regards to harmful algal blooms is likely a latent response. Meaning when that sediment's suspended, phosphorus adsorbs to sediment particles, or sort of sticks to the particles. Nutrients are also making their way to the lake. We know that phosphorus, as a primary nutrient, a limiting nutrient, is one of the causes. Scientists refer to causes as drivers of harmful algal blooms, but it's one of a handful that have been identified. So there's sort of multiple pieces here and multiple orders of separation, if you will, right? The latency of the effect of the phosphorus that can make its way to the lake because of, like you say, increased snowpack and then snow melt. So maybe more phosphorus and sediment making its way to the lake, right? But then the other order of separation being that we have many causes, right? It's through long-term monitoring that we've identified that New York State lakes are warming at about 0.6 degrees Celsius per decade. Now we know that warming pattern is also important for the promulgation of these
So at this particular stage, with what you've seen, in journals and what you're reading among your colleagues, do you think harmful algal blooms will be worse in 2025 and or coming earlier this year, or don't you know?
Well, so this is sort of manifestation of these various causes we understand, and then we have to look at the causes themselves. The warming trend is on the increase, right? I mean, we have data to show that. If the waters continue to warm at the rate that we're seeing them warming, we understand that positive relationship between warming water and harmful algal blooms will likely continue to grow. So we need to target the causes that we know we can control. And one of few that we can control is phosphorus, right? Limiting the nutrient that drives
So
the
that
bloom.
comes into the play of what the Management Council does. So for those who may not have watched the 12 times you've been on, what's the Management Council do?
Right, well, so it's our mission to protect the watershed for the benefit of protecting the drinking water supply for the lake, as well as an economic driver and a recreational asset, and of course now and for future generations. So that's sort of a little bit of our mission statement for
So
it.
how big a group are you?
Well, so we are currently staffed by only 2. So
Okay.
we have our lead inspector who works for the Watershed Inspection and Protection Division. We've had up to 2 inspectors at a time working for that
How are they
division of the
funded?
council. We are funded primarily by local government funding for baseline funding, right? So that allows us to cover our operational needs.
No, I meant for inspectors. If you wanted to have additional inspectors, how do you pay for them?
Well, I mean, so they would be, their salaries and or benefits would be built into our annual budget. And so for us, our operations are funded in terms of baseline funding by municipal grants, local grants. But then when we go after projects and programming, for example, we currently have a $500,000 federal grant right now. We leverage grants specifically to get those projects underway.
And what is the second position? Is the second position you?
That's correct.
Okay. So in the past, you've had multiple inspectors. Are you looking to have additional inspectors in 2025, or are you past the budgetary deadline to do that?
I don't believe we expect to have a secondary inspector this year. That's really a board member decision. I'm, of course, supportive. I believe in having inspectors offer a presence in the watershed, making themselves available, and we get a number of concerns from watershed residents, and to provide an early response.
And who sits on your board? Are they by position?
Right. So we are intermunicipal. The directors of the board. The board itself consists of representation from the various municipalities that have directorship.
So I want to get to the 9 elements plan because I want to get to land also. We touched upon it a little bit. So what is the 9 elements plan?
Right. So the 9 element watershed plan focuses on phosphorus reduction. It names primary strategies and recommendations to meet that ultimate goal of phosphorus reduction, and it's one of several clean water plans issued by New York State.
And so where does the 9 element, you've put together a plan, you have submitted it, am I correct?
And it's approved.
Okay.
Ultimately, the plan is considered a pathway to funding, right? So the plan is approved. We write proposals for grants and programs that target the recommendations within that plan so that we are well positioned to rank highly within New York State programs.
And where do you stand on the grant front right now?
We're doing fairly well. So I mentioned we have the one federal grant that's for a stream stabilization sort of infrastructure protection project down on the Owasco Inlet in the town of Locke.
So these are what you consider ecosystem services?
Well, I mentioned ecosystem services to you earlier in the context of some of the land preserves that we are targeting for acquisition.
So do you own land?
We currently own a 161-acre parcel in the towns of Sempronius and Summerhill. It is now, in my view, aptly named the Fillmore Nature Preserve. It's just down the road from the birthplace of Millard Fillmore.
Okay.
And
it's separate from the Owasco Flats, which is what the city has at the bottom of Owasco Lake.
That's correct. Yes, there are some.
I should say bottom. The southern.
The southern,
too.
yes, the southern end of the lake, and there are several owners who are preserving lands down in the Owasco Flats area. But the
Why is that important?
Right, so the importance there of land preservation really has to do with what you mentioned earlier, protecting what we refer to as ecosystem services. And really what that portends are the services provided by nature that we may take for granted. For instance, the targeted acquisitions typically have wetland areas and forested areas. And those areas are very useful for settling sediments, for biological treatment and uptake of pollution. For instance, unlike nitrogen that changes form, phosphorus mass loads, so it can actually mass load into trees themselves. And also, in sort of a broader scale, when we're talking about...
So better to go into trees than into the lake.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Reducing runoff, reducing peak flows, right? So wetlands, so when there's a big storm, they act as a sort of retention basin to allow the water to be captured, to settle sediments before that water ultimately makes its way to the lake.
And so we had Andy Zepp and Congressman Walsh, former Congressman Walsh, on here a couple months ago, with the Finger Lakes Land Trust. Do you work in conjunction? I know they just purchased some land, or had some land donated to them, quasi, just east of here. Do you work in conjunction with the Land Trust as well?
We do, yes.
So this is not a one-off. You're all talking to each other.
This, for us to be successful, our efforts are all about collaboration. And through collaboration, we identify what we refer to as synergies. For instance, the City of Auburn went after really its first watershed type grant project in collaboration with the Management Council and other players for what's called a stream corridor assessment project. So essentially going into, in this case, it's the Owasco Lake Huck 12 at the north end of the lake. Huck 12 is the sub-watershed, to evaluate the condition of these stream corridors. Based on their findings, we then subsequently can go after grants to stabilize those corridors, but also to target land acquisitions where possible in those corridors. And so, for instance, our partnership with the Finger Lakes Land Trust, who also has a grant specifically for easements and land acquisitions in that sub-watershed, is very interested in the outcome of this particular project, because that then helps them rank the targeted areas where they would go after acquisitions.
We only have a minute left. I want to just ask it in a general question. What's the outlook for the coming year of your work plan, and what do you see as the biggest obstacles? Forget the lawsuits for a second. That's always an obstacle. What do you see as the biggest challenge for the Management Council this coming year?
I would say the biggest challenge remains what I've seen for the past several years, perhaps to some extent since I've been involved, and that is tackling barriers to change. Really, when I started my role, I didn't really have a true sense of how much of making change has to do with behavioral science, understanding what it takes for people to actually want to change their ways.
Because your PhD's in what?
Aquatic science.
Not in behavioral science.
Not in behavioral science, right? So I've learned some tools, right? I mean, we're focused on recognition initiatives, so recognizing those who are making progress, who are
doing the right thing.
Who are doing the right thing. And so that's been important. We also have our Lake-Friendly Living Pledge. We're asking people to take advantage of taking that pledge.
Last question, how can people make the pledge?
They can visit our website. That's olwmc.org. They'll find the banner there for Lake-Friendly Living. They can take the pledge and then thereby pledge to conservation practices that are recommended.
As I told you, 30 minutes goes very quickly.
Sure
we did not cover a lot, and I hope you'll come back on, especially in the fall, to give us a wrap-up of how the year has gone, and hopefully it's not as bad as last year. But our guest has been Dr. Adam Effler, the Executive Director of the Owasco Lake Watershed Council, Management Council. We want to thank you for joining us, as you have done regularly each semester. And we'll be back in just a minute with be on the front page with the Auburn Chamber Orchestra's President, Ellie Colvin, who'll be talking to us about Pop's concert, Let's Go to the Movies. It'll be this Sunday at 2 p.m. at the Rev, or better known as the Merry-Go-Round Theater, at Emerson Park. On Thursday, we'll have a discussion with Erica Ryan, the Executive Director of Homesite, to talk about their programs and what their office offers to our community. Next week on Tuesday, we'll be back with Donna Lamb, the Executive Director of the Schweinfurth Art Center, as well as Auburn's new Police Chief, Matthew Androsco, will be here to talk about his priorities and his goals for the department. If you'd like to send us your ideas for questions for any of our guests, or suggest a guest that we should have on, you can do so at cozguytho@aol.com. I'm Guy Cosentino for CU Community College. Thank you for watching. Stick around. We'll be talking with the Auburn Chamber Orchestra in just a moment. Otherwise, we'll see you back in the studio on Thursday.